that was also something that was important. Let me click that. OK. I'm sure all of you guys have seen this by now, but I am once again asking you to sign up for RvB. I know that I am going to be talking about RvB, and the next 2 weeks are going to deal exclusively with RvB. However, we are asking you to sign up for RvB. RvB is going to be held on November 12th from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. You will get to learn a bunch of skills from business, IT, and system administration areas. We welcome you to join, even if you are a beginner, even if you are somebody extraordinarily experienced. We encourage you to come. And you can join as an individual. You can join as a pair. You can join in a group of 3, or you can join as a team of 4. Signups will be closing this Friday at 11:59 p.m. So if you haven't signed up, we encourage you to sign up now. As you can see, currently we are here at RvB Prep checklisting. On Friday, we will be holding our RvB Prep Build an Environment workshop, which is highly recommended to go to. On Tuesday, we have strategies, which also is very highly recommended. We will have no workshop next Friday in observance of, I believe it is Veterans Day. And then on Saturday, we will have Fall RvB. So first off is checklisting. So besides the very generic thing that I put up there, can somebody explain to me what a checklist is? I said beside the little explanation that I put up there, but essentially that's exactly what a checklist is. When you're in a competition, sometimes you might not exactly remember what you need to do. And to keep your memory fresh and also to help keep track of what you've done, a checklist is an extraordinarily important tool. So what goes in a checklist? Well, this is going to sound very funny, but in a checklist, you want to check for very specific things. And I will go over more detail about these. But another thing that you're going to put into a checklist is tips for you to look for vulnerabilities. And finally, you're also going to want to do a little bit of system maintenance, because you're not always going to end up with the most perfect system. And especially with RvB, you're not going to end up with a completely clean system. You're going to end up with a couple of flaws here and there. So just be warned. But what doesn't go in a checklist? Don't put an entire config file in here. Has anybody here heard of php.ini? php.ini is the configuration file for PHP once you install it onto Linux. And for those of you who haven't seen it, that file is extremely long. And there are many settings inside of that file that need to be changed. And because of that, you really don't want to post your entire config. The checklist should give you a very basic idea of exactly what you should be changing. But other than that, don't just post entire configs in there. Not only that, don't put extreme down to the wire details of everything you need to do, because that will just make your checklist harder to read and harder to look at quickly in a pinch. So keep your checklists concise and keep them still detailed enough to understand what you need to do, but not overly cluttered and unreadable. So let's talk a little bit about system maintenance. So system maintenance is something that is done to make sure that your system is running smoothly and it is up to date. Now, I've posted a couple of examples here, and I will be going into these in more depth. But can anybody give me an example of what you might do on a Windows box, for example, to make sure that it is up to date and current? Turning on automatic updates. That is something very good to do. And it'll essentially ensure that when something new comes out, especially if it's a security update, it'll basically go right in and be installed. Can anybody give me an example of something you might do for system maintenance for Linux? I don't need a specific command, just like an idea. Don't worry, don't worry. Exactly. Firewalls are a very good way to help prevent unwanted attacks. But now let's go a little bit into updates. So I'm sure that everybody with a Windows computer has seen this screen at least once in their life. basically in Windows, going to Windows Update and performing updates is a very good way to make sure your software is up to date. In Linux, you might recognize the apt update command. Apt update will make sure that your packages are completely up to date on an on a Debian-based system. Can anybody tell me the appropriate command for Red Hat-based systems? Hint, it's not apt. It is yum. That is correct. So on any Red Hat-based systems, you're going to want to do yum update. So update your stuff. Make sure that all of your software is up to date. Because what happens is the older a software is, the more likely somebody is going to go in and try to find a vulnerability with it. And especially with new releases, those new releases will oftentimes fix security bugs. For example, let's say we have an outdated version of a very common SSH server. And we go in and we have this old version of SSH. Now, what if somebody has discovered a flaw in there and they happen to find out exactly what version of SSH you're running? Well, from there, the people can go in and they can exploit that flaw. But if you update to a version of SSH that doesn't have this vulnerability, well, you don't have to worry about that anymore. So updates are an extraordinarily important thing to do. Not only that, you also have to worry about OS updates. Now, technically, they're both under the update category, but making sure your OS is up to date will make sure that all of the underlying software libraries and everything else that comes with the OS are also up to date. So for example, we have the SSL libraries in Windows and Linux that will be kept up to date with new software updates and OS updates. And there's also a whole bunch of other stuff. I won't go into the details now. You're also going to want to put stuff about user management. Now, why would we want to deal with users in a checklist? Anyone? Well, in a system, you cannot guarantee. Oh, sorry. Exactly. You never know if you're going to find a random user who is not supposed to be there. For example, one very common thing that was done in Cyber Patriot, which I guess you could draw like one or two similarities to RvB with, is adding an unauthorized root user. Now, for those of you who will remember from my Linux workshop, the root user has an ID of 0. And because of that, anything that needs to be done as root will be done as the user with ID 0. But what people can do is they can put a root user called tour, which is root backwards, and they'll also give it an ID of 0. And that'll essentially say, hey, there's another user that you have to that you can log in as, and therefore you can also log in as root. Now, searching for those things is as simple as writing into your checklist something like, hey, check the users. Because especially if you are provided with a list of users that you might want to make sure are in the system or validate your current list of users against, it'll be very helpful to make sure that red team can log in as a totally different user that you weren't expecting on the system. Let's go into software management. I know I talked about updates earlier, but that's not the only kind of software management we have to do. We have to make sure that we don't have extra software on the system that isn't supposed to be there. Now, why would we want to do that? Exactly. And because of that, we have to make sure to remove anything that's not supposed to be there. We should also check for permissions. And I recognize that this might apply a little bit more to Linux, but Windows also has an entire permissions kind of section in file properties. So why would you want to check for permissions? Well, the reason is that sometimes you might be given permissions that you weren't supposed to have, and sometimes you might be giving random users permissions that, again, they weren't supposed to have. So permissions are another good way to prevent access from hackers and also restrict the avenues of attack. Anti-red team strats. So you guys might recognize the top one. That's a firewall. Now, can anybody explain what a firewall does? That's a pretty good explanation. Firewalls will block ports, specific ports, and only allow certain ones. As you can imagine, that basically restricts the potential for access all the way down from like the tens of thousands of potential ports to just maybe like 2. So any potential hackers would have to essentially restrict themselves to those ports in order to get in. Of course, firewalls are not a foolproof strategy because you can always pretend to be a service on that port. You can also just hack into the service itself. So you just, kind of negate the firewall protections there. But it's a good way to restrict access. Now, has anybody here heard of a reverse shell? What's a reverse shell? Whoever said mm-hmm. Somebody mm-hmmed on this side of the room. Okay, maybe I'm hearing things. And why is that? Yeah, pretty much. And not only that, but a reverse shell essentially allows you to get a shell, like a remote shell. So you can log in to somebody else's system remotely. Essentially, you don't have to use SSH for that. You can use something like Netcat. As you can see over here, you can create a Netcat reverse shell, and you can essentially listen to that and log in remotely, and yeah, you'll have full access from there. Not only that, but you should also monitor connections. Now, the reason behind that is that you might not always recognize when an attacker is trying to get into your system. And if you see an unknown connection, then it might be safe to assume that it is something that you should be careful of. Especially in my experience, I've seen like random bash connections open up on the Linux box, and I'm like, that's not supposed to be there. I end it, and I suddenly have stopped having problems for at least a little while. Can anybody tell me one useful tool for monitoring connections besides the one that's up on the screen? Sorry? Wireshark is a good tool for monitoring your packets. However, I'm not sure if that's the most practical thing to always have up and running, but that's a good thing to have. What's another useful tool? You could have an intrusion detection system. However, you might not always have the time to install an intrusion detection system. More simply, you can look at a tool called Netstat. Netstat is a tool that essentially allows you to check all of the listing services and connections. This is else off, but Netstat kind of shows you very similar things. So yeah. Hi, Taylor. Configs. Now, I remember that I said you shouldn't post entire configs into your checklists. Yeah, that is true. However, you should still put general ideas of what things in those configs you want to change. So for example, if I were to write a section into my checklist that talks about SSH, what is one thing in SSH that you should always check for is set to no? Yes, permit root login, or is it permit root login? I forgot the, yeah. Essentially, you always want to make sure that permit root login is no. So in your checklist, you might say something like, check that root cannot log in, or something like that. Pretty simple. If you were to create a FTP share, you might also write something like, don't allow anonymous access, or don't allow anonymous write access, or don't allow anonymous this and that, because there's a lot of potential anonymous options in FTP. And now we're going to go ahead and take a look at this really old checklist that I made like 4 years ago. I would like to point out the irony that I don't actually use checklists these days, even though I am the one giving the presentation about checklists, which is, in my opinion, slightly funny. But that's not what I was saying. Also, you're on microphone, you do realize, right? Anyways, so let's take a look at what I've done here. First of all, ignore the names. I made everything salad themed way back in the day. You can see, first things first. Now, I said that I must print out the README. Now, why would I want to print out the README when I could just open this up on my computer? Well, printing out a README is a great way for you to be able to physically mark something. It is also a great way to prevent clutter on your box's desktops. So if you have a README, it's probably not a bad idea to print that out. Again, this was made for Cyber Patriot, so some of the things might not apply to RvB. For example, forensics questions, you're not going to have those in RvB. But yeah, so let's look into the miscellaneous stuff. So I also didn't fully understand Linux at that time. So I said go into sudo mode. That's not what I'm doing there. But I'm logging in as root using sudo. But anyways, one important thing to check is visudo. What visudo does is it allows you to open the sudo configuration file and change how sudo works for your system. And one very, very funny thing to do is defaults !authenticate. Now, for those of you in comp sci, what does that exclamation actually mean? That is correct. So that says defaults not authenticate. That means you're not checking to see if I'm the person I said I am, which means you're not being asked for a password. Now, you can clearly see why that would be bad, because it means anybody can log into root without a password. So you'd want to delete that line. And then I say we check .bashrc and etc bash.bashrc. Now, the reason why I said that is because, did I hear my name? Oh, okay. The reason why I said that is because .bashrc is the place where you can find aliases for your particular user. Now, an alias is essentially taking one command and giving it another name. So for example, I could alias ls as ls -- color equals auto. And that is something that is by default done on Ubuntu systems. But sometimes you might have a troll who just changes your aliases and changes ls to echo haha, you got played. So every time you did ls, it would print out haha, you got played. Now, obviously, you don't want that to happen, so you could go in and you could just remove that from your bashrc. And then here you can see that for the config files, I didn't specifically list exactly what I need to do, because I already knew that what I had to do in these particular things. Now, sources.list is a file in the apt configuration section that basically lets you configure exactly where you're pulling package lists from. And that is important because sometimes you might have a package list that you don't want to be there, or sometimes you might see a package list that it kind of doesn't really matter for your system, so you might as well just remove it. Don't worry about temp periodic. And then you can see also I say update, upgrade, disable root login. Again, I'm not putting extremely specific things. I'm putting just reminders to do some things. Like I'm saying install various important packages, and I listed libpam cracklib. Don't use cracklib, it's old at this point. Looking for non-work related media files. Checking changing system memory settings. And in some cases, when there are long commands that I might not exactly remember, like just in my head, I'll put them here. So for example, I'll put like echo none, the kind of stuff go on from there. But I'm not doing that for every single thing. I cannot stress the importance of keeping your checklists concise and easy to read, because if not, you'll spend all of your time being like, wait, why did I write that there? Wait, what does this mean? Oh, wait, oh, that's what that means. And then, actually doing the thing after that. If we continue on to the next page, we can see that I continue this. Now, what is one thing that I did extremely wrong here? I'll give you a hint. It's all the way at the top. I put a for loop, and I told it to remove everything in that list. Honestly, you don't have to put code into your checklists. You can just like put a list of some bad things and just like remove them from there. The reason why I did this back then was because if I remember correctly, I was too lazy to just take everything from my for loop and just write them all out. So I just kind of posted that in there like, aha, that'll be good enough. But don't do that because that'll make it hard to read and it'll make it not exactly fun to read either. Because, I mean, you're not going to want to go through and be like, OK, what's exactly in here? OK, John, netcat, bind 9, telnet, iodine, kismet, blah, blah, blah. Wait, why is there a for command? Oh, right, just in case, I wanted to do that. You can also see over here that I've created a new section for firewall. And that's because firewall settings are extraordinarily important to block access, as I mentioned earlier. And because of that, I didn't just put this in the services section that I had before. I went and gave it its own section. So for anything that you think is extremely important and shouldn't exactly be classified with other things, you can create your own section and be like, hey, do all of this stuff over here. So for firewall, I said make sure UFW is installed. Make sure to reset all the rules because sometimes people might leave in bad rules. Enable it to make sure that it's enabled by default on system startup. Add some defaults, and then make rules for individual services. That is something important. If you're going to enable firewall, make sure that your rules are set before you enable the firewall. Because let's say that I'm scoring SSH, and then you turn firewall on with defaults, and by default, it'll block all incoming connections. Now, let's say scoring engine tries to connect to your box over SSH. I mean, if you're blocking all connections, it's going to block SSH too. So it's going to be like, hey, I can't connect to that, which means you don't get points. So when you're doing firewall stuff, make sure that your rules are set before scoring happens. And then you can also see at the beginning of a backdoors section. Now, I've listed a couple of tools here and a couple of places to look. Can anybody explain why I've put cron tabs here and exactly what cron tabs is? Pretty close. Cron tabs run things at certain times. So if you have a cron tab that has a bunch of stars, that means it's going to run every single second of every single minute of every single hour of every single day of every single week of every single month. I believe that's the extent it goes. So like if you see that and then you see like nc-lvp, you're like, hey, wait a second. There's a netcat reverse shell here. Let's get rid of that. You can see that I've listed multiple cron tabs just in case I forgot where some of these cron tabs might be. And I also realized that there are some shortcuts to some of these things. I also list one file here called rc.local in /etc. That is quite an outdated file these days. You don't exactly find it very easily unless you specifically create it for a purpose. But rc.local is a file that it's essentially a script that runs upon system startup. So you can easily put something there like if your networking is broken, you could be like, hey, just start the networking upon boot up, and then voila, it just starts. You can see that I put netsat-tolpan. You can see that I put ps-aux. Anybody know what ps does? Mr. President? Yep, it stands for PlayStation. It also stands for process. But PlayStations are cool too. But ps-aux will let you see every single running process. So, you can see why that might be useful. And I didn't include more beyond this point, but let's go over exactly what I've done with this checklist. So you can see that, first of all, I haven't put too much detail into this. I gave myself a reminder of things that need to be done. Second of all, I grouped everything into individual sections, so I know exactly what I've done at all times. And I know exactly what is being done and under kind of like what general area those might be in. Now, you don't have to follow my formatting. This is something that I made in like an hour one day when like right before competition because I didn't actually have a checklist. But mix and match your formatting. Mix and match the order of everything based on what you think is important. If you think it's important to do all your software updates first, by all means, put that in first. If you think it's really important to go through and check all the config files first, go ahead, put that first. There. Does anybody have any questions about checklists? I also recognize that today's meeting was, pretty fast, but there isn't a lot that you can really say about checklists. Huh? Okay. Did you just add it at the end? I see it. Critical business services. Yeah. Yeah, I see it. So a critical business service is something that is going to be something that is essential to your business's business. And it is something that if it goes down, it will negatively impact what your business does. So for example, let's take Amazon. Amazon uses AWS for everything, I'm fairly sure. And a lot of companies around the world use AWS to host all. So if Amazon's web service went down all of a sudden tomorrow, what's going to happen? Exactly, millions of dollars gone, and potentially even billions. And something like that even happened recently. Like one AWS server went down in the US, and because of that, millions of users from all different kinds of websites were suddenly unable to access anything. I don't remember any examples of any apps that weren't working that day, but there was a lot of commotion. And there was also a lot of web articles after that about how much we rely on AWS. This Friday, we will be going over how to set up a critical service and keep it alive. Not to spoil a little bit of what Bryant has planned, but it'll be dealing with a LAMP stack. It's literally the exact same slide, except you changed one to. Yeah, I meant to delete it. Yeah. So, yeah, there we go. So does anybody have any questions about checklists and what to put on them? Going once? Going twice? Going a third time? Okay, apparently not. So, yeah, thank you very much for coming to today's meeting. Again, sorry that it was so short, but it really isn't much to say other than kind of what exactly might go onto a checklist. So once again, we're going to be having our build an environment workshop on Friday. I highly recommend that if you are going to participate in RvB, that you come to this workshop, because you will be learning some very, very important things that could be used to help you during the competition. Thank you very much.